Malcolm "Mac" Jackson was a man who thrived on order. At 42, he'd built a life that ran like a well-tuned engine, steady, reliable, and purposeful. By day, he worked as a mechanic at a small auto shop in Willow Creek, a suburban town just outside Raleigh, North Carolina. His hands, calloused and stained with years of grease, could coax life back into any machine. By night, he retreated to his sanctuary, a modest two-story home with a wraparound porch, a small garden of tomatoes and peppers, and a driveway he'd paved himself one sweltering summer. It wasn't fancy, but it was his, a testament to years of saving, dreaming, and doing things the right way. Mac wasn't the type to seek attention. He waved to neighbors, kept his lawn trimmed, and minded his business. His life had a rhythm: wake at dawn, brew coffee strong enough to wake the dead, head to the shop, and return home to tinker with his latest project, a '67 Mustang he'd been restoring in his garage for 3 years. The driveway was his lifeline, the artery that connected his home to his passion. He didn't have much, but he had that. Then came Evelyn Pritchard. Evelyn, or Evie as she insisted everyone call her, lived next door in a sprawling McMansion that dwarfed Mac's home. She was the HOA president, a title she wore like a crown, and she had a way of making her presence known. Her platinum blonde hair was always teased into a perfect helmet, her outfits a parade of pastel cardigans and pearls, and her white Mercedes SUV gleamed like it had never seen a speck of dust. She was the kind of woman who'd stop you mid-conversation to remind you of the community bylaws, her voice dripping with honeyed authority. It started innocently enough. One Tuesday afternoon, Mac pulled into his street after a long shift, his pickup truck rattling from a day of hauling parts, only to find Evelyn's Mercedes parked squarely in his driveway. Not on the edge, not halfway, dead center, as if she'd measured it for maximum inconvenience. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and figured it was a one-off. Maybe she'd had a delivery truck blocking her own double-wide driveway. He parked on the street, grabbed his toolbox, and let it slide. But it wasn't a one-off. The next day, there it was again, gleaming under the late September sun. Mac's jaw tightened, but he wasn't one for confrontation. He knocked on her door, his work boots scuffing her pristine welcome mat. Evelyn answered, peering over her reading glasses like he was a salesman she hadn't invited. "Afternoon, Evelyn," Mac said, keeping his tone even. "Your car's in my driveway again." She tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Oh, Malcolm, I'm so sorry. I had landscapers over, and they needed room to maneuver. You don't mind, do you? It's just for a bit." Mac minded. He minded a lot. But he nodded, forcing a tight smile. "Just move it when you can, all right?" "Of course, dear," she chirped, shutting the door before he could say more. She didn't move it. Not that day, not the next. By Friday, it was a routine. Mac would come home, see the Mercedes, and park on the street, his patience fraying like an old timing belt. He left notes under her windshield wipers: "Please don't park here. Mac." They vanished, crumpled or ignored. He knocked again, and she'd offer excuses: contractors, guests, a sudden emergency that required her to borrow his space. Each time, she'd flash that smile, as if charm could erase trespassing. Weeks turned into months. Mac's driveway became Evelyn's personal parking lot, and his quiet life started to chafe. He'd come home exhausted, lugging tools or groceries, only to trudge an extra 50 feet because she couldn't be bothered. The Mustang sat untouched in the garage, its hood gathering dust, because he couldn't maneuver it out past her car. Neighbors noticed. Old Mr. Henderson across the street would shake his head, and Mrs. Lopez next door would mutter about "that woman," but no one said much. Evelyn ruled the HOA with an iron grip, and people feared her petty retaliations: fines for overgrown grass, complaints about porch furniture, letters about unsightly mailboxes. One rainy evening, Mac hit his limit. He'd spent 12 hours at the shop fixing a botched transmission, his back aching, his stomach growling. He turned onto his street, windshield wipers slapping, and there it was, her Mercedes, parked at an angle, blocking his garage entirely. He sat in his truck, rain drumming on the roof, and felt something snap. Not anger, not yet, just a quiet, resolute enough. He parked on the street, marched through the downpour, and pounded on Evelyn's door. She opened it, holding a martini, her expression a mix of surprise and annoyance. "Malcolm, you're soaked. What's this about?" "Your car," he said, voice low but firm. "Move it. Now." She blinked, then laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Oh, come on. It's pouring out there. I'll move it tomorrow." "You're not using the driveway tonight, are you?" "I use it every day," he said, stepping closer, water dripping onto her pristine foyer. "This is my property, Evelyn. I've asked you nicely. I'm done asking." Her smile faltered, but she recovered fast. "Well, I'm on the HOA board, Malcolm. We're a community. We share. You should think about that before you make a fuss." "I'm not sharing my driveway," he said. "Move it, or I will." She scoffed, shutting the door in his face. Mac stood there, rain soaking his jacket, and made a decision. He wasn't a loud man, wasn't a fighter by nature, but he was a fixer. And this? This needed fixing. Back in his house, he dried off, brewed coffee, and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through contacts until he found it, Creek Towing, a local outfit he'd used for shop jobs. He dialed, explained the situation, and hung up with a time, 7 a.m. tomorrow. Evelyn wanted to play games? Fine. He'd play too. That night, he didn't sleep much. He sat on his couch, sipping coffee, staring at the Mustang through the garage window. It wasn't just about the driveway, it was about respect, about boundaries, about a man's right to his own space. Evelyn didn't see him as a neighbor, she saw him as a pushover. By morning, he'd prove her wrong. At 6:55 a.m., the tow truck rumbled into the cul-de-sac. Mac stepped onto his porch, arms crossed, as the driver, a burly guy named Tony, hopped out. Tony glanced at the Mercedes, then at Mac. "This the one?" "Yep," Mac said, handing over his property deed. "It's on my land." Tony nodded, hooked the car up, and within 10 minutes, the Mercedes was gone, hauled off to the impound lot on Route 12. Mac watched it disappear, a weight lifting off his chest. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, just went inside, started his day, and waited. Evelyn's reaction came fast. By 8 a.m., she was at his door, banging like she meant to break it down. Her hair was wild, her cardigan askew, her voice a shriek. "Where's my car, Malcolm?" "Towed," he said calmly, leaning against the frame. "You wouldn't move it." You can't do that," she sputtered. "I'll have you fined. I'll call the police." "Go ahead," he said. "It's my property. Check the deed." She stormed off, muttering threats, but Mac knew the law was on his side. He'd checked with a buddy at the sheriff's office weeks ago. Evelyn could rage all she wanted, facts didn't care about her tantrums. For a day, it was quiet. Mac parked in his driveway, worked on the Mustang, and felt the rhythm of his life settle back into place. But he wasn't naive. Evelyn wasn't done. She'd come back swinging, and he'd be ready. Evelyn Pritchard didn't take defeat lightly. To her, Mac's tow was a declaration of war, a personal affront to her status, her authority, her very existence in Willow Creek. She wasn't just a neighbor, she was the HOA's queen bee, a woman who'd spent years cultivating influence through bake sales, board meetings, and carefully worded emails. Mac, with his grease-stained hands and quiet demeanor, wasn't supposed to challenge her. He was supposed to bend. So she struck back. It started small, a petty jab to test the waters. 2 days after the tow, Mac found a note taped to his mailbox. Your porch light is too bright. HOA Regulation 4. 2 states exterior lighting must not disturb neighbors. Please adjust. E.P. He snorted, crumpled it, and tossed it in the trash. His porch light was a standard bulb, same as half the street. She was grasping. But Evelyn escalated fast. By week's end, an official HOA letter arrived, claiming his garden violated aesthetic standards because the tomato plants were unkempt. Mac stared at the paper, incredulous. His garden was his pride, neat rows, staked vines, not a weed in sight. He'd seen Evelyn's own yard, a jungle of ornamental grasses and tacky flamingo statues. This wasn't about rules, it was about power. He ignored the letter, but Evelyn wasn't deterred. She called security next. One evening, as Mac hosed down his truck, a patrol car rolled up, lights flashing. The officer, a young guy with a nervous twitch, stepped out. Sir, we got a report of suspicious activity. You live here? Yeah, Mac said, shutting off the hose. What's suspicious about washing my truck? The officer shifted, glancing at Evelyn's house. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching like a hawk. Someone said there was a stranger loitering. Just checking. Mac's eyes narrowed. That someone wouldn't be Evelyn Pritchard, would it? The officer coughed. Look, man, I'm just doing my job. You're good here. He left, but the message was clear, Evelyn wanted him rattled. She didn't stop there. Flyers appeared overnight, stapled to trees and mailboxes. Is this a neighborhood or a battleground? Let's promote peace, not pettiness. No names, but the implication was obvious. Neighbors whispered, some smirked, others rolled their eyes. Evelyn's crusade was backfiring, people knew her game. Mac stayed calm. He'd dealt with worse, deadbeat landlords, racist foremen, a childhood in a neighborhood where you kept your head down or got it knocked off. Evelyn was a nuisance, not a threat. But when she parked in his driveway again, a week later, he knew calm wasn't enough. It was a Saturday, crisp and clear, perfect for working on the Mustang. Mac had the garage door open, tools spread out, radio playing Motown classics. He turned the corner onto his street, and there it was, her Mercedes, parked like a taunt. Not just in his driveway, but angled to block the garage entirely. A note fluttered under the wiper, I'll move it soon. E. He stood there, hands on hips, and laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. She thought she'd won. She thought he'd back down. She was wrong. He called Creek Towing again. Tony answered, chuckling. Same car, same spot. You know it, Mac said. Make it quick. 15 minutes later, the tow truck rolled in. Neighbors peeked out windows as Tony hooked up the Mercedes, its white paint gleaming in the sun. Evelyn burst out mid-tow, waving her arms. Stop. You can't do this again. Watch me, Mac said, leaning against his porch rail. She screeched as the car lifted, tires dangling. This is harassment. I'll sue. Sue all you want, Mac said. It's my land. Second time's the charm. The truck pulled away, and Evelyn stood fuming, her face a mask of fury. Mac went back to the Mustang, humming Marvin Gaye, but he knew this wasn't the end. Evelyn would escalate, and he'd be ready. That night, he sat on his porch, sipping sweet tea, the Mustang's engine purring in his mind. He wasn't just fighting for a driveway, he was fighting for his peace, his dignity, his right to exist without someone stepping on him. Evelyn didn't get it yet, but she would. Evelyn's second tow lit a fuse. She didn't just want revenge, she wanted a spectacle. By Monday, the HOA email blasted every inbox in Willow Creek, recent incidents have disrupted our community's harmony. Let's work together to resolve conflicts peacefully. Attached was a photo of Mac's house, his truck in the street, captioned, "Parking disputes can be avoided with communication." Mac read it at the shop, grease smudging his phone screen, and shook his head. She was painting him as the villain, the unreasonable one. He didn't care what she thought, but the neighbors? That stung. He'd lived here a decade, fixed their cars, shared his tomatoes. Now she was dragging his name through her petty mud. The flyers came next, glossy, professional, taped everywhere. Do we want a neighborhood of tow trucks or togetherness? People talked. Mr. Henderson stopped him at the mailbox. "She's got it out for you, Mac. Watch your back." "I'm watching," Mac said. "She's the one who should worry." Evelyn's next move was bolder. She hosted an emergency HOA meeting, inviting the whole street. Mac didn't go, why bother, but Mrs. Lopez filled him in. Evelyn stood at her podium, pearl necklace glinting, and ranted about certain residents disrespecting community values. She proposed a new rule, shared driveway access during peak parking times. It didn't pass, too many saw through her, but the intent was clear, she wanted control. Mac kept his routine. He worked, tinkered, ignored her noise. But when her Mercedes rolled into his driveway a third time, a week later, he didn't call the tow truck. He had a better idea. It was a Sunday, and the neighborhood was alive, kids biking, grills smoking. Mac watched her park, bold as ever, then grabbed his phone. Not for towing, for recording. He filmed her car, panned to his deed on the table, and narrated, "Third time this month. My property, my rules." He posted it to the Willow Creek Facebook group, tagging Evelyn. The response was instant. Comments flooded in, "She's at it again? That's ridiculous. Mac, you've got more patience than me." Mrs. Lopez shared it, adding, "Evelyn's been parking there for months. Enough's enough." By evening, it had 200 likes, 50 shares, and a dozen stories of Evelyn's overreach, fining kids for chalk drawings, harassing a vet over his flagpole. Evelyn retaliated with a post of her own, "I'm disappointed in this slander. I've only tried to foster community." But the tide had turned. People saw her for what she was, a bully cloaked in HOA clout. Mac didn't gloat. He towed her car again the next day, third time's the charm, right, and let the neighborhood watch. Evelyn's downfall wasn't just public, it was personal. She'd underestimated him, and now she was paying. Evelyn's reign crumbled fast. The third tow, paired with Mac's video, sparked a reckoning. Neighbors rallied, petitions circulated to oust her from the HOA, stories of her tyranny poured out. She fought back, threatening lawsuits, but her bluster rang hollow. At the next meeting, she was voted out, 32-5. Mac didn't attend, he was in his garage, the Mustang roaring to life for the first time in months. She never parked in his driveway again. Her Mercedes stayed in her own space, and her presence shrank, fewer waves, fewer smiles. Mac's life returned to its rhythm, work, home, the hum of his engine. But he'd gained more than a driveway, he'd gained respect, a voice, a community that saw him. One evening, Mr. Henderson brought over a pie. "You stood up, Mac. We all should have sooner." Mrs. Lopez planted peppers beside his tomatoes, a quiet thank you. The Mustang rolled out, gleaming, a symbol of his persistence. Mac didn't need revenge. He'd won by being himself, steady, unshaken, a man who fixed what was broken. Evelyn faded, a cautionary tale. Mac thrived, his driveway his own, his peace restored.